Great. Well, it's wonderful to see everybody. Good evening. We have 235 people registered and almost 100 people on Zoom right now. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sheila Hare, and I'm a clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University School of Law. And I get to do the boring stuff like thanking people, which is, we're very, very grateful to the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for sponsoring this series. And I just wanted to say that we'll be putting in the chat information about this series. It's called Understanding Human Trafficking. And there are future panels, and there are also panels that we've done in the past, and they are all up on the website, almost all of them with links, so that if you're interested in any of that, you can see that there. I'll put it in the chat right now. And I keep saying chat, but it'll actually be in the Q&A. We'll post that link. I also wanted to point out that we have bios and reading materials, and I'm a huge fan of the reading materials. There's a lot there, and my co-panelists or my panelists were telling me to stop. But if you have any spare time, I really encourage you to go and look at those readings. Some of them are very quick and are certainly quite interesting on this topic. And I just want to say how excited I am to actually have two QU law alums on this panel. One of them is Alicia Kinsman, who's like a leader in anti-trafficking work in the state. And the other is actually Danielle Robinson-Briand, who just recently came back into the life of QU. She was such a force when she was a law student here, and she's actually helping us teach a class on Guatemala and planning trips, as she did when she was a student to Guatemala, for students who want to work with immigrants and are interested in exploring that on the ground in Guatemala. So thank you so much, Danielle. She's now an attorney in Minneapolis, and we're just so delighted to have her here. But before I pass it along, I actually wanted to say we're also thrilled with the other panelists who are leaders in their fields, and we're just incredibly grateful to them for joining us today. Logistics. We have CLE credit. So Danielle, actually Barbara is going to be helping me put the CLE information in the Q&A. So be to see that as the webinar progresses. And we also, as I was mentioning, have a Q&A. So you can post questions in that Q&A, and they will be anonymous. And Barbara and I will try our best to go ahead and send those questions and get as many of your questions answered. So please, we encourage you to use the Q&A and put in any questions that you may have. And I just wanted to say how excited I am about sort of pushing the discussion. You'll notice if you look at our Understanding Human Trafficking series that we've done a lot on sex trafficking. And we're really also trying to sort of broaden the discussion to also include labor trafficking, because I think a lot of people we talk to are less familiar with labor trafficking and what it looks like. And I'm really excited today that we've got an incredible group of panelists to talk about a little more about the background and how people become vulnerable, and today in specific, migrant children. And finally, before I hand it off to my amazing student, Barbara, I just wanted to say a lot of times on these panels, folks ask, what can we do? And I feel like today is an especially appropriate moment to be having this panel, because there is a bill pending in the Connecticut legislature to expand Husky healthcare coverage to all undocumented kids in Connecticut. The legislature expanded it to kids at the age of 12, and there's a push now to expand it further. And maybe that's something we can get to today, but I will put a Connecticut, I think, Mirror article on that in the chat. And of course, if you have any questions, we'll also put our emails. You can follow up. We'd love to see your support on this, and certainly open a conversation if you want to learn more. So with that, I'll pass it along to my amazing student. She's Human Trafficking Awareness Chair, Barbara Roche, and I am thrilled to be passing it off to her because I think this is in a panel that really speaks to her experience. Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks, Sheila. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name's Barbara Rocha, and I'm the co-chairwoman of this year's Human Trafficking Prevention Project Awareness Week here at Quinnipiac School of Law. And the HTPP was formed 6 years ago when students and like-minded faculty members came together to train hospitality workers in Connecticut on signs of human trafficking. From these trainings, the Human Trafficking Prevention Project expanded into other areas, and today the organization has 4 pillars: training, client representation, legislative advocacy, and awareness events. So with training, in addition to hotels, we also train schools, hospitals, the general public, and essentially anyone that'll listen. If you would like to train your business, church, PTA, or any other group, you can reach out to us. We have 2 incredible co-chairs that are ready and willing to discuss that with you. And we'll put our HTPP email in the chat. For second client representation through the Civil Justice Clinic at Quinnipiac, we provide direct legal support by helping trafficked persons. Through legislative advocacy, we work on getting legislation passed that will help trafficking victims. 2 years ago, actually, we drafted and helped pass a provision that expanded vacatur in Connecticut, which allows trafficking survivors to ask the court to vacate a criminal conviction if the conviction occurred because they were a victim of trafficking. And finally, awareness events, such as this panel tonight, which is the final event of our yearly HTVP Awareness Week series. And before I let our moderator, Danielle, take over, I just wanted to thank the Connecticut Bar Foundation, the Connecticut Bar Association, as Sheila said, and Sheila, our faculty advisor, QU Law, our panelists, our moderators, my co-chair, Sarah, and the rest of the HTVP board for all our efforts and commitment to this mission. So please, join me in a virtual round of applause for their hard work. Yay. Now Sheila asked me to briefly mention a bit about my background because the topic is near to my heart. And as a current law student and former dreamer or DACA recipient, I understand how deeply migration can impact the lives of those who choose to take the journey and those who did not make that choice. For me, I arrived in the United States at 3 years old and was raised and educated in Connecticut by the American education system. This is the only country I know, and I've actually never been to Brazil. My journey to residency, permanent legal residency, was a winding road, and it's different for every member of my family. And for me, I got lucky, unlike others that you'll hear about tonight. So there are some important differences in my journey. I was lucky enough to come with my parents on an airplane. I didn't have to suffer through some of the things that you'll hear about tonight, but nevertheless, it's an honor to introduce everybody and be a part of this mission. And I'm so excited to be a part of it. This panel is an honor of and to bring awareness to all of those who refuse to surrender to a situation that they did not create. And with that, Danielle, please take it away and introduce yourself in the exciting lineup of panelists we can look forward to hearing from tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. You are most certainly a model young woman, and I'm very honored to know you, and thank you for sharing about your story. Over the last decade, we've witnessed a dramatic increase in the number of migrant children arriving at the US-Mexico border. The migration that we are talking about is not pre-authorized, and the children arrive without the proper documentation for admission into the United States. Therefore, upon their arrival, the children are apprehended and processed by US border officials. We have a couple of slides that we wanted to show to sort of explain the salient moments that child migrants go through along the journey. The first slide, which Sheila will help share, is it up? I'm sorry, I don't know if I can see the slide.
Sorry, Danielle, it's coming right up. My apologies. Just
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Can you see it?
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so the data that you see in this slide shows the last 10-year period, 2022 backwards to 2012, and the data is organized in 3 different columns by total apprehensions by Border Patrol of migrants at the border, and that includes men, women, and children. The middle column is the total number of child migrants who are apprehended at the border by year, and then the third is unaccompanied minors. So the unaccompanied minors are children who arrive at the US-Mexico border without either of their parents. And as you can see, the number is rising. And in 2021 and 2022, it rose dramatically. 2014 at the time was considered a watershed moment on this issue when a total of over 68,000 child migrants or unaccompanied minors actually were apprehended. The volume was unprecedented at the time, overwhelming the system used to receive and process them, and leading to many disturbing images of detained children being circulated by the media. So the next slide shows a border processing or CBP processing facility in Brownsville, Texas from 2014. So this particular photo was published in The Nation and shows the conditions that the children are in when they're first received. And you can see that it's not humane. They're sleeping on the floor, and most notably to me as a mom, there's no adult in the room. So it's unfortunate to think about that as being their point of entry. The next slide shows a processing facility in Donna, Texas that was taken in 2021 and was published by CNN. And it shows exactly the same conditions as 2014 when the Obama administration deemed the situation a humanitarian crisis. As the first slide indicated, the number of apprehensions of unaccompanied minors more than doubled last year to 149,000, exposing the hard truth that this crisis has not abated over the years. Rather, the number is trending upwards, with tens of thousands more children arriving each year. If you go to the next slide, you'll see I calculated by country. So some of the main sending countries are from the Northern Triangle region of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, but you also see a large percentage coming from Mexico. So the first set of data shows the total child arrivals by country of origin, and the second set of data shows just the unaccompanied minors, so children arriving without their parents. And so it's interesting that the ordering changes in the second set of data, and it shows clearly that the vast majority are coming from Guatemala, but also significant numbers from Mexico, Honduras, and El Salvador. So what this data doesn't reflect it in this slide, but there are children coming from other countries in the Americas, namely Nicaragua, Venezuela, Peru, and Ecuador, which matches some volatile events that are happening in those countries. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to show the homicide rates in the Northern Triangle and the surrounding region. This data is from 2021 and was published by Insight Crime. This shows the homicide rates, which is the number of murders per 100,000 people. This slide is very clear that Honduras is the most violent place in the region, but also Mexico is very violent, as well as Guatemala and El Salvador. So the literature on unauthorized migration to the United States, focusing on children, does emphasize the correlation between violence rates, these homicide statistics, and the numbers that we're seeing at the border. Our panelist, Autumn Quesada Grant, is a historian of Latin America who uses her deep knowledge about the Americas to provide expert opinions in asylum cases. Autumn will focus her talk on the multiple root causes. Flight from violence is a recurring theme in her asylum cases she shared with me, as clients recount how everyday experiences like going to school or playing outside are life-threatening in their home community. The calculation to leave one's country is complicated, and the journey is fraught with challenges and hazards. Panelist attorney Alicia Kinsman has worked with immigrant survivors of trafficking for over a decade. We will hear from her about what it is like for children to come to the US without advance permission, transiting through some of the most violent places in the world at the hands of predatory and notoriously violent trafficking networks. She will also discuss these children's vulnerability to trafficking in their receiving communities here in the US. This slide shows a family climbing what's called La Bestia, or the Beast, which is a freight train or cargo train that runs from Chiapas, Mexico up to the border. I was compelled by this image in particular because it shows some unsafe behavior, I would say. The next slide is a scene where you can see just the sheer number of people that come to the United States this way. But they also come in through other channels, which we hope to get into. You can see in the image too, the Honduran flag. I was, happy to see that show of pride, I guess, which is interesting in the face of what they're doing, which is taking huge risks to come to the United States. Our panelist, Alyssa Whitfield of Attorneys with or an attorney with kids in need of defense, will explain how child migrants are processed once they are apprehended by border officials, where children are held while in government custody, what the process is for placing unaccompanied child migrants with caregivers in communities around the United States, as well as highlighting known abuses that children have suffered while in government custody, or abuses that they suffered pursuant to deterrence strategies implemented by the United States. So you see in this slide, a 2-year-old child, she's from Honduras, actually. She's having an emotional reaction to her mother being arrested by a border official. This was in 2018 in McAllen, Texas, and shows that forcible separation that was the policy at the time, and obviously impacted thousands of people in a very traumatizing, severe way. The next slide shows a tent city that emerged along the border on the Mexican side in Reynosa, Mexico. This is from 2022, and it's the Senda de Vida tent camp. Thousands of people are staying in tent camps like this because they have not been able to enter the United States. They are forced, pursuant to the policy, to remain in Mexico. The next slide I included just, to show the resiliency of children despite the conditions. So here a young man is playing with a piñata, which is a very popular custom in the Americas to celebrate a birthday. And it actually warmed my heart to see that they were having fun, even if it's for a moment. The next slide is, so the next slide and the one after it depict Oscar Alberto Martinez, 25 years old, and Angie Valeria, his 2-year-old daughter. They're from San Martin, El Salvador, and the photos were shared by their family. Unfortunately, Oscar and Angie were trying to get to the United States, and they did not make it. We have the next slide, which was a highly circulated photo of their drowning in the Rio Grande in 2019. But we wanted to show the image, even though it's very concerning, and but to show this audience that people are taking risks against their own lives, and the situations that they're fleeing are also risks to their lives. So it's not a win-win situation at any stage of the journey. Our final panelist, Megan Feich, represents newly arrived immigrant youth in her work at Connecticut Legal Services. Since child migrants who arrive at the US border are technically in violation of US immigration law, attorneys like Megan help young clients to navigate the process of deportation and pursue avenues for legalizing their immigration status. Of course, by the time child migrants reach the US, they have already gone through many traumatizing experiences, which inevitably impact their transition into life here on this side of the border. This slide I included just to show the spike in migrant fatalities in 2022. So it reflects hundreds of people dying in this attempt to come to the United States every year. And then the 2022 numbers really show a dramatic increase. The next slide is a picture of Jacqueline Amé Rosemary Calmaquin. She was 8 years old. She's from San Antonio de Cortes, Guatemala. Her story was circulated in the media too when she contracted a virus while in US border custody. And she unfortunately did not receive adequate medical care, according to many reports, and she passed away. And the final slide is a view of her funeral in Guatemala, in the community where she was born. So obviously, and you can take down the slides now. This is a deep and difficult conversation to have. And I am very excited by the panelists who have a lot of knowledge and work to protect people by exercising their immigration rights here in the United States. Autumn, I'd love for you to start. Just give us your knowledge from being a historian to set the scene about what's going on in the Northern Triangle countries, what's going on in Mexico, and why so many people are leaving the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila, for inviting me, and Danielle for helping. I'm going to introduce myself first, and also excuse me if I look down at my notes, because this is such a broad topic that I made myself a little bit of an outline in order to keep close. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Professor Autumn Quesada Grant, and I am a Latin American historian and also Latin American cultural studies expert. I have been, for the last 7 years, been working as a consultant, as a country conditions expert in courts. So I'm here to help you. That is my role. So as you guys work on the US side of law, I understand law for the countries that I work on. I work on 7 countries, now 8, all issues, and I have worked on somewhere around 400 cases. So even though I'm a full-time professor and I incorporate this into my classrooms, this is also my other full-time job. In addition, I have also helped 8 major universities work with their third year law students in order to help them to understand how to use an expert witness, how to use a country conditions expert witness, no matter if they're an immigration attorney or if they're going to be doing pro bono work. Because again, I work very, very closely with the attorney in order to help the attorney understand the situation in which the people are coming from. So that's a little bit about me. And also I'm located in Rhode Island at Roger Williams University, and I'm the chair of my department. So my role in this whole process, and I'm going to sort of stick to the theme of women and children. And I know you mentioned Mexico, but I'm also really going to focus in on the Northern Triangle, although I could talk extensively about Mexico as well. So my role is to couch these current conditions in these countries. And these countries I have worked in. I have worked on the ground in these countries, in addition to teaching, and I have a tremendous amount. I'm a modern historian, so I have a tremendous amount of knowledge of history, recent history, whether it's 10 years or 40 years, in order to explain what is happening today. And I do extensive research for my reports that I hand over to the attorneys and hand over to the courts. So my work answers or addresses the questions that we have here. And the major question is, what are the factors from Latin America that are driving people to the US border? It used to be we call it the push-pull effect, right? So the pull in the past for looking for a better life or finding work, that was closer to 2000 and whatnot. But now we see an extreme push, as we see with the numbers of push. And you mentioned, Danielle, the date of the year of 2014. Even in this extent that I can address why 2014, I can address what is going on based on my knowledge related to all of these various issues as to why we see such rises in numbers and whatnot. So in this panel, we focus on women and children, and the general question, so what is driving them to the border to ask for asylum? And the answer is overwhelmingly violence. And it's everything from state violence to organized crime violence. So we call them TCOs, transnational criminal organizations, discrimination, and one that I very much want to hone in on is gender violence. This is one that I address a great deal, is gender violence, especially from Mexico and the Northern Triangle is what I see. So it's really important to understand these stories. We have to situate the asylum seeker's story within a larger narrative. And that's my role. I know the history. I know, and maybe you as the attorneys also somewhat know the histories, but I've read the constitutions, maybe you have too. I read the laws and I look for holes in which these people cannot be protected. That's my job. So I know and can explain histories that produced these horrible, unimaginable experiences that they are connected both to history, cultural conditions today, and traditions. And that's one thing that I spend a lot of time, if possible, in court trying to explain the difference between US thought to DHS as well as immigration judges, that there's a different way of thinking. And so I have to work on that with the court in order to have them understand that there's a lot of issues to be considered in this. So to address quickly women and children, why women flee with or without children, or why it is that children are fleeing by themselves. There's a huge uptick in this with unaccompanied minors. So first, women are fleeing because of terrible gender violence. We used to call this domestic violence. I start using gender violence because I also teach gender and sexuality studies. So this could be anything from domestic violence rooted in cultural traditions that cannot be broken and are socially acceptable. And I talk often about explaining to the court private sphere versus public sphere and how the police get involved or don't get involved. And the fact that there are laws and sometimes not laws that protect women. And so this is a huge issue in order to show that the laws do not protect the women and they do not protect the children. So what we see is that a lot of times women, let's say if a woman is fleeing without children, sometimes she's fleeing with the children, it's from abuse. And it is from abuse perhaps from a domestic partner, or it is abuse from a gang member or a cartel member or a neighbor or something like that. Generally, we see enormous amounts of rape, and we have to take rape very, very seriously with this as gender violence. So in addition to rape, women are also forced, if they are left alone, into extortion, depending on what country we're talking about. They're often threatened with death. And I always push the argument of there has been a precedent of harm, but I also push the idea of future harm, and I go to the extreme, which is femicide. And I want the court to understand the seriousness of femicide. El Salvador, for example, Honduras, El Salvador, are two of the most dangerous countries in the world for femicide. And femicide goes unpunished. And femicide can happen by a domestic partner, and it can happen by just anyone, this sort of thing, and it goes unsolved, uninvestigated, this sort of thing. So
I have a question for you, Autumn. I don't mean to interrupt, but
Sure.
This is actually something that comes up often in asylum cases that I bring before the court. So we focus a lot on gender-based violence as a reason why people are escaping their countries, and that it constitutes persecution within the realm of asylum. So I'm wondering too, since we're looking at child migrants, do you see that the domestic violence that is occurring prevalently in some of these countries is driving more children here as well?
Absolutely. So, like I said, women will sometimes flee if they can, if they are not killed by their persecutor. Women will often bring their children with them because the children are witnessing this domestic violence, which includes everything from beatings to rapes to threats of violence. Again, this could come from a variety of persecutors and whatnot. And the mothers want the children out of these situations. And again, the laws do not protect them. And this is why they are taking this sort of last ditch decisions in order to save their lives, is what happens.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Just to keep with our time for this section, we're going to move to Alicia, but I do want to come back to you to get into why the laws are not functioning. That's an argument that I bring up often in the courtroom, whether it's successful or not. It's true. So Alicia, your role today is to explain what it's like for migrants from this region to come to the United States. How are they making the decision? How did they get here? What are the hazards that they face? And what is their vulnerability to trafficking?
Thanks, Danielle. So the children that I see, right? Because this isn't my story. This is the story of the clients that I serve, the family members of the clients that I've served. But the children that we work with are running for their lives, right? They're running sometimes with mom, as Autumn discussed, sometimes to mom, right? Because mom had to make her escape earlier and has not been able to go back. And sometimes from mom or dad, right? But they are running for their lives, right? A child who is making the decision or who is has the decision made for them to make this truly perilous journey is doing so because that's the better option, because that's safer than staying home, right? Those images of the children, like, they always trigger me big time. Danielle, I know you're a mom of littles too, and many of us, I'm sure, on this panel. And, no mom would choose to put their children into that position unless that's the better option, unless that is closer to hope and closer to freedom. The children that we work with are running not only from violence inside of their home, but also in their community, as Autumn also explained, from state violence, from growing government corruption, in places where you can't call the police when something bad has happened to you because it is the police, right? Or because the police can't do anything or won't do anything about it. They're children who are attempting to do something legal, right? Coming to a US border, presenting yourself for admission to request asylum is a lawful form of relief. There's no other way to do it. You can't request asylum unless you get here first, right? They are attempting to make this perilous journey to request a legal form of relief because of the serious violence they're experiencing or the persecution they have faced or will face if forced to return to their home country. The trip is perilous and long. The environment is dangerous, right? Train rides, bus rides, hidden in back of box trucks, walking across deserts where the temperatures increase over 100 degrees even at night in every season. But also the journey is navigated and facilitated by, most often, by smugglers. And so these are children who are essentially putting their lives into the hands of smugglers who are the only ones who know the route, who've paid off the cartels or are part of the cartels or paid off the government officials to be able to navigate this route to the United States. They are not good people with the best intentions in mind in most instances, right? And so they are certainly helping to navigate this route, but sell and kidnap and exploit the individuals whose lives they have essentially in their hands. We've worked with children and families who were kidnapped, who were then, their parents were extorted, their traveling companions were extorted. Children and women in particular are subject to sexual assault. Women are provided birth control by smugglers because sexual assault is essentially inevitable on the journey. There hasn't been one person, and certainly not one child with whom I've worked who has made that journey who has not suffered some kind of serious trauma. And that trauma is likely a secondary to the trauma that sent them on this perilous journey to the United States. And part of the danger that they face is human trafficking, right? That is a large piece of what we're talking about today. In some instances, that was one of the push factors, right? Because they were vulnerable to serious exploitation in their home country, and perhaps trafficking. In some instances, they've been exploited en route to the United States, right? Forced into sex trafficking or labor trafficking or both as they made the journey into the United States. And in some instances, once they've arrived here.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That what you were saying, the way that you were talking about children running for their lives, reminded me of a report by the United Nations that was published in 2014 called Children on the Run. And then there's a similar report called Women on the Run. And I use that often in court cases when I want to make certain points. And I think what's frustrating to me is that report was published in 2014 and it's only more relevant today in 2023. So anyway, thank you for getting us through to the border. Alyssa, our attorney panelist from Kids in Need of Defense, will explain to us what it's like for children to cross into the United States, what happens to children once they are apprehended by border officials, where do they go? All of these logistical questions. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Danielle. Yes, and thank you, Alicia. As Alicia was mentioning, many unaccompanied children, when they're arriving in the United States, actually turn themselves in at the border. So it's not that children, in many cases, are being apprehended, it's that they're presenting themselves to Customs and Border Protection at a port of entry or right after they've crossed a river and gone to look for Customs and Border Protection. And that's because children are often seeking protection in the United States, or they're seeking to be reunited. Well, it could be both protection and to be reunited with family members. So more than 80% of unaccompanied children have family members in the United States. And in more than 40% of the cases, the child has their parent or their legal guardian in the United States. So children are usually looking for the help of the authorities to find their families. I did want to quickly mention a couple of ways that children sometimes become unaccompanied when they arrive at the border. So first, children who are traveling with their parent or legal guardian are subject to Title 42 and are often summarily expelled. So since March 20th of 2020, the Department of Health and Human Services has had an emergency regulation in place implementing Section 265 of US Code Title 42, which allows the director of the Centers for Disease Control to prohibit the introduction into the United States of individuals when they believe there's a serious danger of the introduction of a communicable disease. So because of the COVID-19 pandemic, CBP can and does prevent people from entering the United States, even if they are lawfully seeking asylum. But since August of 2021, there has been an exception for unaccompanied children from these Title 42 regulations. So what this means is that some families traveling with children have to face an impossible decision: all be turned back or send their children alone. And I've personally spoken to families who were afraid that their children would be murdered in their home countries and so they sent their children alone to be reunited with family members in the United States. And in fiscal year 2021, at least 12,212 migrating children re-entered the United States alone after having been expelled from the country with their families under Title 42. So that's one other way that sometimes people become unaccompanied. Another issue that can cause children to become unaccompanied is family separation. So family separation is an ongoing problem at the US-Mexico border. People listening to this presentation likely remember the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, when thousands of children were deliberately separated from their parents at the border in an attempt to deter families from coming to the United States. After the ACLU's litigation challenging these separations, the official zero tolerance policy ended, but CBP continues to separate minors from adults that they are traveling with. For example, if officers believe that the adult is not the legal guardian of the child, like their older siblings or an uncle, and then children removed from their family members are then classified as unaccompanied. So developing some sort of highly expedited process for approving these close relatives as sponsors would prevent needless family separations and reduce the number of children in custody. And officers also use their discretion to separate children from their parents where there's a safety concern for the child. And according to data from the Department of Health and Human Services from January 2021 to September 2021, for example, 387 children were separated from their parents or legal guardians. And these extremely difficult decisions are being made by CBP officials without adequate training in the best interests of the child. So our organization has called for the government to place child advocates from the Department of Health and Human Services at the border to assist with these kinds of determinations. And then you had asked about where children go once they are in custody at the border. So the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services share responsibilities for processing unaccompanied children. And CBP, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, initially detains and interviews migrant children at the border, or occasionally ICE will detain and interview the child if the child is in the interior of the United States. And at the border, DHS can repatriate right away Canadian and Mexican unaccompanied children at those respective borders who it determines are capable of making the decision to withdraw their request for entry, are not at risk of trafficking, and can safely return home. But other children are placed in removal proceedings and then have an opportunity to seek asylum or other immigration relief. And these children remain in CBP custody for a period of time. And the conditions in CBP custody have been extremely poor and extremely crowded. And the Biden administration has struggled to increase capacity for increased arrivals. We saw some of the pictures that Danielle put up at the beginning of this presentation of the kids in what looks like cages. Children in CBP custody are often sleeping on the ground in enclosed jail-like conditions, sometimes with a mat, sometimes with a Mylar blanket, in unheated concrete cells. The temperatures can drop very low at night. And so people making this journey often call these concrete shelters the hieleras in Spanish, which means the ice boxes. The US government many years ago was sued about the conditions for detained migrant children specifically. And the 1997 Flores Settlement Agreement requires the government to release migrant children expeditiously to sponsors, hold them in the least restrictive environment. It requires the government to detain children in facilities that are safe and sanitary and provide access to toilets and sinks, drinking water and food, medical assistance. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, the TVPRA, limits the amount of time that unaccompanied children can be in CBP custody to 72 hours, except in the case of exceptional circumstances. But there's been a lot of testimony from groups like human rights Rights Watch and other organizations, and from families and children themselves, the children are often held longer than this due to a lack of capacity, including being held at influx facilities and emergency intake facilities without contact with their family members or regular access to showers or clean clothes or toothbrushes or proper beds.
Situation sounds dire the way that you're describing it. And, you know, that is in my mind exactly how Jacqueline passed away, because she came to into Border Patrol custody after the perilous journey. And then, you know, the conditions that you're in, being in an overcrowded environment, being subjected to really low temperatures. I mean, all of it is just, you know, coming together to make a young person subjected to it and not receiving the medical care that is deserved in those circumstances. It's unfortunate that that it continues to happen. Megan, our next panelist, is working at CLS, and she represents immigrant youth in that work. Can you tell us, Megan, what forms of relief are available to your clients once they're released from custody, and what the transition is like for them to enter US society and start living here on this side of the border?
Certainly, and thank you to the other panelists for framing this conversation. It's important, again, like Alicia said, the stories that I'm going to be talking about today are not my story, but they are the stories of the people that we meet in our work every day. And so my clients are all children that have come to Connecticut because they have family members here, and they have connections to our state. And they are referred to my organization through different nonprofits that they might come in contact with, or because of a family member that's seeking immigration legal services representation for them. My clients come from many different countries. Many are from Northern Triangle countries, but also Colombia, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, from really all over. But what I want to say is that all of them have experienced adverse childhood experiences, either in their home country, along the journey, or at the border. And this is why it's important for practitioners in this world to always bring a trauma-informed lens when working with these children. My youngest client is 4 years old, but there's a huge span of folks that I represent, young children, but also teenagers and then young adults. And each of them has an individualized experience and reason why they fled. But the second sort of grounding piece is that although many adverse childhood experiences have happened in the past, these children also face huge obstacles that other children in the United States don't face that are citizens here. First of all, many of them are placed with a new or unfamiliar caretaker. I want to tell you a story of one of my clients who was a 12-year-old girl from Honduras. And when she was 3, her mother had to flee because she owned a hair salon and was being extorted by the gang in her community for a war tax. And because of the age of her child, she knew that she couldn't risk her safety by bringing her along. So she fled and left my client with her godmother. My client then lived without her mother for 9 years and was raised by this woman who then passed away from a heart attack while my client was 12 years old. She had no other choice at that moment but to come to the United States. Her father had abandoned her at a very young age, and she had no one to take care of her. So she travels the long journey to get here and experiences all of those terrible things along the way, but then starting life in the United States with somebody that she is her mother, but she hasn't lived with for 9 years. And that's going to come along with so many difficulties and moments of transition that many other children don't have to face here. And as many of our other panelists have said, there is a history of trauma, but our clients don't have access to the same sorts of supports that U.S. citizen children have. Clients are not eligible for Husky in our state unless they're under the age of 12, which is a really new and exciting development. But so for young adults that have had a long experience of trauma, they're not going to be able to access mental health care because unless they have a caretaker that's able to pay out of pocket for that. And also there's just generally an unequal experience that many of them have. I have one client who's a great soccer player, and he, has dreams of traveling abroad and participating in competitions in other countries, but because of his status, he's unable to leave. He's also unlikely able to get funding to play soccer when he goes to college. And so his dreams in many ways have to be tamped down because of his position in our society. And so I could go on about the obstacles, but I know we have limited time. So I also just want to touch on the legal routes that these children have to relief in the United States. And I know some folks on here might have some background in immigration law, but for those that are unfamiliar, I just want to start out by saying, unless there's not a legal way to do this for many of our clients, but what they are doing, and they're coming to the border and asking for asylum, that is a legal way. And so when we hear a lot of this rhetoric about illegal entries and illegally crossing the border, that's not true, and that's not their experience. And so one of the forms of relief that many children might be eligible for is asylum, which is for individuals that are fleeing that very specific persecution or violence in their home country. Asylum is very challenging to win, and children clients have specific difficulties in recounting and remembering the experience in a way that could be persuasive to an adjudicator. And it also requires, there were some questions about what is sort of the level of persecution that one needs to experience. And it can't just be a generalized fear of violence. It has to be a very individualized harm or fear of future harm for that child. And that's a very challenging standard for many children to meet. And so if they lose their asylum case in the United States, they will receive a deportation order and be deported back to their country. So those are the stakes that are sort of hanging over many of our children clients. And the cases that I work with almost exclusively at CLS are special immigrant juvenile cases, which are for children that have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents. And so some of the stories that we've talked about today touch on that. And so the way that I sort of screen folks for that is by just learning about their stories, and that although those words have legal definitions, that manifests differently in each child's experience. And the most important thing in my mind is to approach it with a non-judgmental lens, and everyone's experience is individualized, and to never sort of pass judgment on the actions of the child's caretakers in their home country, because we are here and not there. But if they are eligible for the special immigrant juvenile status, that is a process that is often pursued in the probate courts of Connecticut, where we can go to the minor child's probate court where they live in their town or their city, and ask the judge to hear their story, which is often prepared in a written declaration, and see if it qualifies, and if it meets that standard of that their parent has abandoned them. So that's the primary finding. And then the secondary finding is that it would not be in the child's best interest to return to that country. Which unfortunately, because of the children that we are seeing, that is almost universally true. Whether they've experienced something specifically harmful in their home country, or they're being provided with the support and resources in the United States that they need, it's often something that we can, that is the case in our client situations. And if the probate court issues an order making that determination and removing the offending parent's guardianship rights, it gives not only an option to pursue permanent legal status in the United States, but it provides security and safety and consistency for those kids who are now living with one parent or a family member that has those sole guardianship rights.
Thank you so much, Megan, on SIJ. I wanted to turn to Alicia really quickly to find out about the U and the T. Do you use that in your practice? And when, what are the kinds of situations that you've seen in your clients' experience that would qualify them for those forms of relief?
Sure. So I think the unfortunate reality of every immigration practitioner is that we are always screening for these victim-based forms of relief, because as we've been talking about, many individuals who are running from their home country, seeking refuge here, are vulnerable to exploitation. And especially if they're remaining here undocumented, especially if they are children, they're vulnerable to exploitation and victimization. And so that may result in eligibility for other forms of immigration relief, like a U visa, which can be available to individuals who've been victims of a list of qualifying crimes, or the T visa, which is a form of immigration relief available to individuals who've been victims of human trafficking, as defined by the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, either sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or a combination of both. Trafficking is a major theme of what we're talking about today, and the vulnerability of children, and specifically unaccompanied alien children, to that type of exploitation and victimization. And to be clear, not all UACs are victims of human trafficking, right? Not by a long shot. However, they are vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable because they're children. Full stop, right? Their little bodies, their little brains, they are vulnerable to exploitation. But more than that, they are most likely traumatized children, right? Children who have run for their lives from some serious trauma in home country and or experienced trauma en route to the United States, right? They are children who are trying to build a new life in a new and unknown place, in a place where they may not speak any of the languages around them, right? Not speaking English, may not even speak Spanish, right? If they're coming from an area where it's an indigenous language that's spoken. They are in removal proceedings. These are children who are being deported. The government is actively trying to deport them, and they're expected to find Megan, right? To find an attorney. 4-year-old. When I was at Siri, we had a client that was 6 months old, right? They're expected to find and hire and work with, retain an attorney to represent them in their removal proceedings. It is, and navigate education and life. It is fraught with vulnerability. And even in the best case scenario, as Megan was saying, the best case scenario is we have a child who is running into the arms of his mom or his dad, who he has been desperate to reach, who has all the love in their heart to give, who only wants to support and provide, has only their best interest in mind. But it's a parent who has not parented the child directly in a long time, and a child who has not been parented by that parent in a while, and maybe reaching an adolescent phase and dealing with all this trauma and struggles and rebuilding a life, and maybe not having health insurance and no benefits and no authorization to work, and not being able to enroll in school because they're told they can't because they don't have a social security number or a birth certificate, right? It's ripe for problems. It's ripe for an explosion, right? In the best case scenario. And sometimes it's not the best case scenario, right? Sometimes children are placed with individuals who don't have their best interests in mind, right? Who may not be subjecting them to human trafficking, that certainly occurs, but maybe exploiting them in other ways, not having them go to school and not providing them the kind of support that they need. And then, of course, in those worst case scenarios, that exploitation is rising to the level of something very seriously criminal. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of that background. It reminds me of so many different cases that I've worked on, and I see Autumn's ready to jump in, and I want her to. But just to finish the thought, I in my own everyday practice have to translate death certificates of people's loved ones in their home countries, and very disturbing events that happen because of the prevalence of firearms in the region. And then they come here, maybe they were extorted along the way in Mexico, as Alicia had pointed out. Sometimes the coyotes or the human smugglers sell their group to other smugglers, or something happens in those illicit relationships that expose children to prolonged false imprisonment, I would call it, where they're holed up in a safe house for a really long time. And they don't know what's going to happen to them. And then the parents here don't know what's going to happen to them. And so it's very scary to go through as a young person. And what is your capacity for understanding it, processing it, and then keeping yourself in this immigration proceeding that's difficult to track and understand for a layperson. So Autumn, I want to give you the mic here. Please enlighten us.
Just very quick, because Sheila had wanted us to address one issue. So to put a bow on what Alicia and Megan was saying is that the perilous journey, like Alicia was talking about, through Mexico, the children do experience a great deal of sexual violence in addition to the sexual violence at home. So just to remind us of all the issues that can happen to children along the way, sexual violence does happen to them. And as was mentioned by someone, the children, as they come, they don't quite know how to process this, and sometimes they may not understand it, and so they can't then elucidate it in their credible fear, for instance. So that's one issue that I wanted to make sure that we hit on, that Sheila said. And then second, and then I'll be quiet, is that we're talking about trauma a great deal, and it is certainly true. And now that since I work with hundreds of attorneys across the United States now for many, many years, I'm working on an article that actually addresses 5 processes of trauma, for like 5 different levels of trauma that everyone goes through, but certainly children as well as others. Yeah. So there you go. Yeah.
Thank you, Autumn, for that. Well, we want to get in some of the audience questions too. Sheila, do we have any questions from our audience?
We actually do.
Okay.
One of the questions says, thanks for such a thoughtful presentation. I'm wondering, for the Connecticut-based practitioners, to what extent your organizations have had any luck connecting young clients with organizations, services, and providers who can help them navigate the transition of next steps with their futures and gaining legal status, SIJS or otherwise. Does Connecticut have a strong network connecting legal and other practitioners, or is this an area of opportunity for us?
Alicia, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think that it's complicated. There are amazing organizations in the state of Connecticut, nonprofit organizations, Connecticut Legal Services among them, KIND as well, the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants, Building One Community, IRIS, Catholic Charities, to name a few, that provide services to immigrants and their families here in the state of Connecticut. Those would include legal services, and in some instances, social services for certain eligible immigrants and their family members. I'm not sure that there is a hub that provides all of those things, I mean, what a wonderful thing that would be. I think that the type of funding that would be needed for something like that for undocumented individuals and their families, I'm not sure it exists, but there are these great organizations providing legal services. There are also other organizations, more grassroots organizing organizations that do so much of that work as well. So much of that direct hand holding and connecting of resources like Make the Road and Junta and Connecticut Students for a Dream, especially, that are really focused on ensuring that immigrant children and school-age children and college-bound students can be connected with mentors and resources about where to go and what to do and how to get support.
Thank you for that. Yes, Megan, please add.
So for children that have entered ORR custody, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the border, I think it's important to realize that once they're placed with their sponsor, family member, typically in Connecticut, there's no more services that are provided. The federal government really takes a step back and says, here's this child that you might not have seen for many, many years. They were getting some services in ORR custody, but now they are not eligible for services anymore. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that they're sort of placed into this situation. And then I just also want to give you some numbers on the scope in Connecticut of what we're looking at here. So there are 27,000 pending cases in the Hartford Immigration Court right now. That's a lot of people. There's 800 of them have been designated as unaccompanied children. Many others included in that 27,000 are also children, but have been grouped in family members. The nonprofits in Connecticut are overly taxed. There's such a huge need for free immigration legal services, and legal services is just one element in this wheel of what recent arrivals need. And so there's just a huge need in our state, given the large numbers of recent arrivals, and so many folks are turned away. And that's just an important thing to think about in response to that question.
I think it's an opportunity for the law students in the audience. There is a career in this. And I see postings come through different listservs all the time about positions around the country that are available, becoming available. And this is definitely a different situation than when I came into the field in 2011. So it also really helps if you're bilingual, because as we said, most young clients are coming from Spanish-speaking homes. Some are indigenous language speakers. I have a couple of clients who speak Hmong or Quiche. So as an attorney, I haven't yet dabbled in the Mayan languages seriously, but I do speak Spanish, and I know Alicia's fluent. Megan is. I'm assuming, Alyssa, you're fluent too. Autumn, I know, is fluent. That's how you get the stories from your clients, by talking to them. And so I want to highlight that as a very good career path that more of you can get into in coming years. So do we have another question?
Sorry, Danielle, can I just follow up on that question? Yeah. Sorry to jump on you like that, but a follow-up is, so once people are granted asylum, what services are available to women and children? And the follow-on to that one is, we've talked about all this violence and trauma and harm that is happening in the home countries. We haven't talked a lot about gangs, but gender-based violence, et cetera, et cetera. How likely are these folks to be getting asylum? I think, Megan, you might have alluded to it, but I wonder if we can underscore that. So 2 parts.
Alyssa, is that something you might want to tackle? How likely is it for a person to get a permanent status of those who are coming over here?
Sure. I mean, I would say that percentage wise, I don't know the exact percentage, but that the odds of people receiving a permanent status in the United States increase a lot when people have immigration representation. and that it's been shown that it's up to 10 times as likely that people who have an attorney fighting for them, presenting the very specific factors that are necessary to receive asylum, that those people are just far more likely to receive a permanent status. And so I think that a big piece of the puzzle is making sure that migrant children have access to counsel.
That is very true. I also want to mention when just the way that the immigration system works, and especially during and after the pandemic, hearings were changed sometimes very suddenly, and it becomes very difficult to track your case. There are mechanisms that exist to track your case, but it is the case, it is the situation for people that if they miss a court hearing, then they're ordered removed. So there's a lot of attrition that way. I come across this regularly where clients did not get connected to counsel in a timely way, and then they have a removal order against them, which absolutely limits their abilities here in the United States.
And Danielle, I was just going to add that many of the individuals that we work with, and especially children, don't even know what the process is that they're in, don't know that they're in removal proceedings. Many think that they've already applied for asylum because they presented themselves at the border. They explained why they were there. They may have even been interviewed. And so they think that they're done, right? And they just have to continue to go to school and not commit crimes, and that's it. When the reality is the absolute reverse. They've only just begun to enter a really complicated system with all of these rules that they do not know exist, like the 1-year filing deadline, right? While children may be exempt from it, there's a general rule that an individual seeking asylum has to do so within 1 year of their entry into the US. But that's not like posted at the border. Many individuals have no idea that's the case. And so they don't have a hearing scheduled for 1, 2, 3, 4 years after their entry if they're in a border state. And so they have no idea and may have missed the opportunity to get asylum even if they were eligible in the first place. And the other thing I wanted to quickly say is that there are lots of individuals who've suffered serious harm and have serious fear of returning home who won't be able to get asylum because the fear that they've suffered or they face doesn't fit neatly into this asylum box, right? Wasn't on account of one of the 5 protected grounds, or they don't have what DHS thinks is reasonably obtainable corroborating evidence, right? There are these really specific and stringent legal rules that may prevent individuals from getting this form of relief despite the horrible things they've been through and the very serious harm they'll face if they're forced to return.
That is a point that I can relate to entirely in my practice. And I regularly share with my clients what the asylum approval rates are. So that orients their expectation about, their chances. And, everybody wants their lawyer to say, you have a great case and you're going to win, but that is not the reality at all. In Minnesota, we have several judges who hear asylum cases. And for some, the grant rate is around 50%. And then for some, it's at like 15%. So it's very low. It really does depend on your jurisdiction, the outcome of your case. And, since clients are coming here and living in an extended crisis mode, they may have to quickly move states in order to seek a job opportunity. And, it really shifts, their priorities shift around the day-to-day survival and not keeping track of this case that I always tell my clients, and I'd like to share with you, the arc of an asylum case, it takes years to play out. And I definitely try to keep cases open if I feel that there's a lack of corroborative evidence or the harm that they suffered in their home country, as Alicia said, doesn't fall squarely within what is recognized under the law. And I feel that in my practice, at least, the ICE attorneys, are really fixated on pointing out inconsistencies or picking away at the theories that were, constantly changing anyway about how a person can qualify under the law for asylum. So it's a very complicated area of the law, and one that becomes very difficult to articulate. And I'm curious, Autumn, what's your experience? What courts do you practice in front of? Or, well, you're not in counsel, but as what sort of venues do you appear in as an expert witness?
I did want to address that and build off of what Alyssa said, as far as getting counsel, whether it's children or anyone else, not to so much advocate for the need for an expert witness. And a country conditions witness is very different than, say, a psychologist or a mental health. I go into great detail, but I go into every circuit court. I have seen it all across. I've probably done about 75% of all the states in the United States. And I have seen all the different rates. What I do want to emphasize, and this is what I've seen definitely since 2018, is that it is so important for an attorney to go in with a country conditions expert, working hand in hand. Usually what happens is the judge, because I'm texting with the attorney the whole time about what's going on, and the judge is on the fence. Maybe DHS has been very aggressive and whatnot, and the judge is on the fence about things, and the attorney is just doing such an excellent job. They bring me in last in order to just reinforce everything that they have said. And that, I've heard it so many times, that changes the judge's mind at the last minute. And it's just amazing.
That's an interesting set of experiences. It's very hard for clients, I would say. In my general practice, you have to pick and choose where you dedicate your limited resources. And even hiring me as a private attorney is a luxury in many ways. And so there's limited resources to bring the cases. And I believe in the power of persuasion. And I think if you lay out the violence statistics, and then on top of that, you have particular evidence about how a person has suffered harm in their home country, it can lead to positive results, but it's very hard to accomplish. And it's, for me, a form of relief that's available to my clients, but at every time I'm looking and thinking about how can we find a different legal mechanism for them that's a little bit easier to attain. And every area of the law is restrictive in many ways, and I think it's designed that way to limit people's ability to get this permanent status. And it's something that I'm hopeful that the current administration might change at some point. What are your thoughts on that, Alyssa?
Let me just say one thing that you're addressing, because I put together a whole list of all the expert witnesses for Latin Americanists across the country, and people charge different rates and whatnot. But a lot of people do exorbitant rates, but I'm very, very, very aware of thinking about what people can do, what they can afford, what they're paying for instance, you or whatever. So I do not ask for anything that is unreasonable or whatnot. So
no, absolutely.
My job there is to save lives.
Yes. Well, and that is actually a very noble profession. And, maybe we can work on a case together in the future.
And Danielle, we have a question on that. Who pays for the expert witness? And then we have a couple of questions to take us back to the specific issue of trafficking and what kind of policies might be able to prevent that. But we have a question in the chat that said, who pays for the expert witness and what is the range?
Let me just say, in my experience, because I am so low in what I ask for, it's really sort of a small honorarium. Either it does come from the client themselves, and usually I ask the attorney to ask the client if that's even possible, and they always say yes. or the attorney, I've worked with them often, or they've heard of me or whatnot. The attorney will say, oh my God, that's so little, I'll pay it out of my pocket.
Well, and I talk to clients about investing in their cases, you know, getting death certificates from their home country requires money to accomplish. Getting it sent to the United States is costly. Then, you know, we attorneys who are in the members of the private bar, we charge for our services. And, you know, I do have qualms about that in my own practice because, you know what they're earning. You have to get a lot of very personal biographic information from people. And, you know, sometimes people are working multiple jobs and getting not getting the wages that they deserve. So it's, you know, an investment in being able to see their cases through. It's not really even an investment in a guaranteed result. I always tell my clients the outcome of your case is in the hands of the adjudicator. And so we just try to make sure that they've met all of the elements necessary to get the status. But again, it's far from sure. But I do work a lot with therapists in our community here in the Twin Cities. And you know, clients sometimes enjoy those opportunities. Probably, you know, it's very therapeutic that they're speaking to trained professionals about the traumas that they've experienced. And, you know, that again is another investment in their case. What would you say, Alicia, in your experience?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. We were just chatting about different ways that clients invest in their cases and see them through to completion.
And Alicia, can I give you a second question to follow on to that? What policies do you think the Biden administration can take absent congressional support to lessen the likelihood that migrant children are trafficked? Sorry to give you two big ones.
Yowzer, that's a question.
Start with that one.
Lessen the likelihood.
I'm going to ask that of all of you, so be prepared.
Absent congressional action, I think is going to be a significant issue there. But there are certainly tools at the disposal of the government, and in particular, the Department of Homeland Security. They have the longstanding tool of prosecutorial discretion to decide when to put people into removal proceedings, how to move those proceedings forward, and when to dismiss cases against individuals. We've seen some, you know, positive uses of that some more positive uses of that prosecutorial discretion under this administration, though I think much more could be done, right? Children, unaccompanied alien children, in my opinion, should not be at all in this adversarial deportation machine. There is no reason for it. You know, I of course am an open borders nut, but beyond that, we're talking about children, young children, 6 months old, 4-year-old children. DHS should be using its tools of prosecutorial discretion to ensure that these kids are not further subject to exploitation and increasing their vulnerability by this additional stress of having to go to immigration court and fight the government trying to deport them, because that is a major issue. You know, we've talked about the vulnerability of children after they arrive here, you know, when they're placed with individuals, family members, or not. And when they're in this situation of having to go to court, get an attorney, that makes things really difficult for them. Again, in the best case scenario, they have a family member who's supporting them, but in many instances is a family member who wants to keep them under that control, who doesn't want to go get SIJ for them, does not want to go seek probate orders. They want to keep them in the dark, out of state systems, out of court systems, away from DCF, right? Because that gives them more control. I've worked with so many children who are placed with individuals who are not going to get immigration status for them, who aren't finding them an attorney and bringing them to court. They are telling them, you're in my house and you cost a lot of money and there are bills to be paid. And so you have to find a job. And guess what? That job isn't cutting it after school. You can't go to school anymore. And you're going to have to do work in the home and XYZ to make up that difference. So this looming threat of being sent back to the place that you ran from makes things so much more and unnecessarily, in my opinion, difficult for children, for babies.
I would agree with that sentiment entirely. I think that there's this unnecessary subjection of young people to this uncertainty. Barbara, you were talking, I see you reappeared. You were talking about your DACA status at the beginning of tonight's panel, and it made me think a lot about how the former administration played with that status and how that impacts the person when they're just trying to live their life and they don't know if they'll be able to renew their status because it's not permanent by any stretch of the imagination. They issue the work permit for a certain period of time. You have to be on that. You have to apply on time or else you won't have a work permit to show. So, I'm glad that you shared your experience in that sense, because it's joyful to see that someone who had to deal with that aspect of uncertainty in their formative years has made it to law school and will be a lawyer at some point. So congratulations to you in your journey that continues. I wanted to turn to Alyssa on this question too. If you could make a change to immigration law as it is implemented today or as it exists on paper, what would be a good start?
I have a very long wish list.
Okay.
Yes. And I would start with things like ending immigration detention entirely. I think it's unnecessary and cruel. But one thing I was going to say that I think is also useful to the question of cutting back on trafficking is the programs that have been expanding for humanitarian parole or for refugee resettlement of people who need to flee a violent situation in order to cut out the part where people have to make this really insecure and dangerous journey to the United States. And so, for example, the Biden administration has restarted the Central American Minors Program, which resettles children who have parents in the United States who are from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras who need protection or who need to reunite with their parents. And so that you can actually make referrals to this program to KIND. If you look up online KIND and the Central American Minors Program, this is a small plug because we're always looking for more referrals actually. But children can be admitted as a refugee or with humanitarian parole if their parent or legal guardian is in the United States with a qualifying legal status, which can include a pending asylum application. So programs like this make it so less children are forced to come alone to the United States. So I would say expanding this sort of program to people from more countries, people who have more kinds of family relationships, that's one thing that I think would be really helpful. And also, for example, in 2022, the Biden administration raised the refugee admissions cap to 125,000 people, but then only about 22,000 refugees were actually admitted. That our processing did not keep up with the commitment that we said we would make to refugees. So actually admitting the refugees that we said we would admit so less people are on this dangerous journey is one thing that I think would make a big difference.
Thank you for bringing that up. That actually makes me wonder, and maybe you know the answer or not, or another panelist does, how long will it take for a young person from the Northern Triangle to get a humanitarian visa and arrive here in the United States that way with advanced permission.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly. I think that will depend on the case, and it's fairly new that they've restarted this program. It actually started under the Obama administration, and then the Trump administration attempted to end it. There was a lawsuit, as there were so many times in the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration is once again processing applications. And so I don't know yet what the average processing time is, but I'm excited about the possibilities for that kind of program.
I am too, especially because there was a start at this alternative sort of way to protect these children, and it was cut off. And it was cut off very suddenly. And it's unfortunate because actual people feel that on the ground. And so, you know, the fact that the current administration has restarted it is a great thing. And I totally agree with your point that you have to not just make the announcements, but make sure that the processing achieves the numbers that have been permitted.
Danielle, we have a couple of really specific questions. One person's asking, what happens if there are no family members in the US to take unaccompanied minors into custody? Is there a Child Protective Services or a Connecticut state equivalent foster care that's an option for these children to stay?
Which of the speakers would like to address
I think
that?
Megan.
Yeah, Megan.
Yeah. So in my experience, I haven't ever had any clients that were never released to a family member. But occasionally they're released to family members that don't want to care for them, or where abuse and neglect occurs after release. And in those sorts of situations, they are eligible to enter DCF care. I think it's almost impossible, but to go back into federal foster care. And I'm not sure how often ORR takes kids out of abusive situations or situations where their caretaker no longer wants them. But they are eligible to enter DCF care in Connecticut. And then the SIDGE process can be pursued in the juvenile court rather than the guardianship court.
Thank you. And we actually have another question about legal screenings. Some people are concerned about the fact that kids may not have representation in court or to help them in terms of achieving legal status. And the question is, can you speak to legal screenings or know your rights trainings for kids in OR custody and the systems in place to help them find pro bono representation? I don't know if
I see some heads shaking, Alicia.
Yeah, so while kids are in HHS ORR custody, they are typically receiving know your rights information and getting legal screenings, typically through a contract with a legal services organization. You know, Siri provides that service at one of the shelters, and Connecticut Legal Services also at another. So while they are detained, then they are receiving that initial legal screening for relief, as well as getting information about the process. But once they're out of OR custody and release, the services they receive are really limited and may just be like basically a check-in within a certain period of time after release. And so making sure that they're connected with legal representation throughout their process is a major challenge, and their eligibility for relief may shift over time after release. So what they were screened for while detained may be a potentially viable form of relief, but not the only one moving forward.
Absolutely. I think the case is common around the country. I've practiced in different states at this point in my lengthy career. And it is the case that there are nonprofits. Alicia provided a long list of those organizations that operate in Connecticut. It's true in most states, I would say. However, the capacity is always an issue for the nonprofits, because we're talking about last year, 149,000 child migrants entered the United States. And, that is a sizable number that way surpasses the available attorneys. So what I think is a huge risk for this population is falling out of the system altogether, because they didn't make it to their court hearing. So then it's in absentia removal order. And, you know, the United Nations has tracked this too, how this attrition rates happen in such a considerable way in the system. So that person with a removal order has very limited remedies under the law for regularizing or legalizing their status. So that's really very difficult. And I'm just thinking of a case that came through my office where the mom received the hearing notice, and they had in their mind that they were going to court. And she worked the day before. She did not remember that court was on a Tuesday, so they didn't make it to court on the Tuesday. She, in her mind, had thought it was Thursday. And then, you know, the removal order, sure enough, had been entered, because that's how it happens. If you fail to appear, it's a removal order. And it's very difficult to try to correct that. A motion to reopen, yes, that exists for a person as a legal remedy under the law, but they still have to find a lawyer that's going to bring it. So it just becomes more of a massive obstacle to pursue your rights.
And we have another question. I don't know, Megan, if you want to address the last question, we also have another question, I think, directed at you. Like, we have talked about fees for experts, and I know that I've seen 1,000, 2,000 more, and, you know, our often tries to get it pro bono. But can you address, Megan, the legal fees to represent an unaccompanied minor? The person who's asking the question assumes that the family is indigent or just above like a living wage. Thanks.
So yeah, I'm a nonprofit practitioner, so we don't charge fees. Our clients have to be below a certain level of the federal poverty level, and then they qualify for free services. I think, you know, that thousands of dollars up to $10,000 for a full removal hearing would be probably on the more affordable end, depending on the type of relief that folks are seeking. And I know that a lot of private practitioners in Connecticut, I want to give you a shout out for offering payment plans, low bono options, because there are just not enough nonprofit practitioners in the state. And just to add to what could the Biden administration do that might help children that are potentially being trafficked. I think one way is funding for legal services. We're talking about children being in a criminal level style proceeding. Like this, they have opposing counsel up against them, and they're unrepresented. And that's just a travesty, in my opinion. And the Biden administration could devote funds for that. There's already a system called NQRP in the immigration court for folks that have severe mental disabilities. The judge holds a hearing, and if he determines them you know, that they're not capable of representing themselves, they can be afforded an attorney. It's a very small program in the immigration court, but something like that could exist for minor children as well. And they could have attorneys paid for them by the government or provided for them by the government, like folks in criminal proceedings are, because the consequences are just as severe.
Thank you for that. I absolutely agree. And it occurred to me to talk about this one anecdote from court. About 2 weeks ago, I went with a young client who came as a UAC, an unaccompanied child, and she had her mom with her that day. So you go into the courtroom and you sit at a table, and then opposing counsel is at a table next to you, and you're facing the judge. And I had my heart set on preparing for this panel. So I was just sort of watching her experience as she was moving through it with extra attention. And the judge, and I pre-warned her about this, the judge is going to ask you your name and who's with you. And that's generally the first question. And she made 2 attempts to say her name and she couldn't say it. And it, to me, showed how terrified she was of the experience. And the judge caught on. He's a very, respectful judge. And he said, would you rather your mother say your name for you? And she just nodded. And it showed me, so much about what she had already been through. And this context of dealing with US officials is a very severe one for a young child. And so hopefully we're hoping that would be her last hearing in court and that we can sort of proceed on the papers, as it were. But that's just a situation where she was being shown respect and she still, felt so powerless. She couldn't articulate her name. And yeah, so that's the experience of representing children in such a tough environment. As I think Alicia pointed out, it's adversarial by nature. And so I'm on the same wavelength about, helping children avoid the experience altogether.
And we have another question. I think this one for Alyssa, with respect to kids at the border. Can you talk about some policies you think might have an effect? I think someone had watched the video, the frontline video about the children who were trafficked in the chicken farm industry, the egg industry. Wanted to know, do you have any thoughts on that? And maybe Alicia as well, like what can we do at the level of the border processing to maybe improve things?
Well, one thing that we have been asking for is to have more child advocates at the border as opposed to CBP doing the screening, because Customs and Border Protection, they're part of the Department of Homeland Security, right? And they really see their role as a very, again, we might say adversarial or law enforcement role. And when it comes to working with children or victims of violence or people who need really sensitive and trauma-informed screening, who need, when we need to make a determination about what is in the best interest of a child, CBP right now is not well positioned to make those kinds of decisions, I believe. And so that is one thing. In terms of border processing also, though, I mean, I think that someone in the comments had mentioned, but Title 42 is ending soon. The very restrictive border policies that have been not allowing people to seek asylum, those policies have been causing a lot of different problems at the border. And so as we wind those down, we're going to see a lot less camps at the border, trafficking at the border, people who are being exploited because of the large buildup of people seeking protection, vulnerable people who are at the border right now. So that's a couple of things. Alicia probably has more to say.
Exactly that. I mean, I think that you really hit the nail on the head. A lack of pathways to safe migration really have contributed to this increasing vulnerability of individuals attempting to cross the border, and in particular, women and children, and in particular, children. People who are forced, who are, again, running for their lives, attempting to do something lawful, which is apply for asylum, but are forced to migrate through a dangerous way, and because they don't have the requisite legal documentation, are vulnerable to exploitation, and they're not safe at any point in the journey. And then children are separated from parents, or coming here without their parents, and are then vulnerable to exploitation through the process and once they've arrived.
I wanted to mention too that, when recent arrivals, recent immigrants, new immigrants come to the United States, they settle in communities where they might have a family member or a friend, somebody from their home community. That's what I see, you know, and I make the joke with my clients all the time because I practice in Minnesota, which is the opposite climate of Central America. And I'm like, why do you come here? What drew you here? And it's always, you know, mi primo, or, you know, my mom was living here for many years and you know, I reconnected with her. So, you know, but it is also the case that the communities where they resettle here are high crime neighborhoods. There's a huge Latino community in Minneapolis, and they were the hardest hit by the George Floyd uprising that happened here. And, you know, I have clients whose apartment buildings were burnt, actually, and they lost their home from one night to the next. There's a lot of profiling of migrants that happens in the Twin Cities. I know that it's the same in Connecticut because I used to practice in Connecticut, and you know, people get assaulted outside of a money exchange business, like global, like Envíos Global or something, is a place where one of my clients was mugged at gunpoint because, you know, it was clear that he had something to gain, something to give in terms of carrying cash. So it's very hard for clients to come to a new environment and feel that they continue to be prey. And, you know, it is even the case in you know, the legal practice that there are attorneys that charge exorbitant rates for some of their clients. And it's easy to justify because this line of work is very difficult. It's very time consuming. The outcomes are, you know, dismal. And so it, you know, it's hard to make a practice out of it. So people do have to charge, but sometimes it's the case where they charge a lot of money and the service is not there. Maybe they've been deceived about the kind of representation that they're going to get, their likelihood to get it. And it's, you know, it's just part and parcel of being a new immigrant that you are subjected to a lot of this. It's discriminatory behavior at its core. And, you know, it actually does provide a new opportunity for people to pursue the U visa if they've been a victim, but who wants to be a victim in order to get a legal status in the United States? So it's just, you know, it's a very precarious situation to be in.
And Barbara, you have a question, right?
Yes, there was a question about do you predict more opportunities like Uniting for Ukraine and for Cuba, Haiti, or Venezuela will continue to be implemented? And were you surprised when they were announced?
Who would like to take that question?
I might have a more cynical view about them. So if somebody wants to say something optimistic.
Mine is cynical too, so.
So, Megan, you put yourself out there. Go ahead.
I'm not super familiar with the Uniting for Ukraine process. I think it's a great thing for the United States to welcome large numbers of people fleeing from violence. So I'm hopeful that more programs will exist like that. But the parole program for Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua is a little bit different. And in my view, it's a way for the Biden administration to turn people away from the border and to continue to keep them from applying for asylum legally. And so people that are funneled into this program are going to be a lot different than our clients. They need to have a sponsor in the United States to sponsor them that has a form of legal status here. So many of our child clients don't have family members with green cards or with that are United States citizens. And also it's a very, limited universe of countries. And I just feel, because it was packaged along with a lot of other problematic proposals by the Biden administration, I think it was a way, and this is my personal view, to discourage high numbers of people coming to the border.
It
Alyssa,
also,
maybe oh, go ahead, Alicia.
it also sets up a little bit of a problematic dynamic between sponsors and arriving immigrants. And again, anytime that we're opening up another safe migration route is a good thing at its core. However, we have to be cautious, because we have seen individuals who come to the US who are recruited to come to the US through this program, saying like, I'll sponsor you, you'll be able to come and go to school and have a better life. And the reality is something different when they get here. That's certainly likely not the majority of folks, but we've seen it happen even with the Uniting for Ukraine program, because people arrive and they are in some ways under the control of the sponsor, even if it's a perceived control. In addition, what they're granted is something that's temporary, and yeah, it's potentially subject to renewal, but renewal for as long as the program is in existence, which may be until tomorrow. We saw this with the first iteration of the CAM program, the Central American Minor Program for in-country refugee processing, when folks weren't granted refugee status, but instead were paroled in, and then they tried to re-parole after the 2 years and it was denied. And now they're here and they had lawful status and now they don't, right? And so what now? What do you do? Where do you go? So there are these issues that are arising. Again, welcome any way for safe, lawful migration, but the dynamic that it sets up between the sponsor and the intending and arriving immigrant, and also the immigrant's prospects moving forward, are concerning, can be concerning.
I want to say, just as a Latin Americanist, I was very angry with this, because being that I know the conditions really, really well of these countries here, I'm very suspicious as to the choice of countries, because these are countries with dire situations and very bad dictatorships. So why are you choosing? What sort of politics is going on with you stemming the flood of people? I mean, especially like with Nicaragua, things are very complicated. So that's a whole story there. But I immediately go to racism. It really worries me that, and it really worries me that he is stopping people who are fleeing the most dire situations right now under dictatorships.
Well, we did find out the other day that there was a plane of over 200 Nicaraguans that arrived in DC. On that plane was someone near and dear to QU's heart, Felix Maradiaga Blandon. He was released, and I'm very happy to hear that. Alicia and I met with him a couple of times. So it's very political, and there's so much that is going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to, and we can only assume. But again, I feel that same conflict that both of you are feeling. It's important to have safe channels of migration, controlled migration, and I've seen some clients be reunited very recently with their son, whose tourist visa expired, so he couldn't come to the United States out of Venezuela. He had to go for a couple of years to Europe to live with an extended family member, and it was torturous for the family to be separated. He arrived in December through that humanitarian program, and will begin his life here. And his parents are overwhelmed with joy because of it. Family separation, forcible family separation is inhumane. We didn't even get to Alyssa to give us an update on the Miss L litigation. But do you have a couple of words to say about that?
Well, you know, and Danielle, we're at 5 minutes, so maybe we can give each speaker time to wrap up. And I'd love to hear that from Alyssa, if that's okay.
Yes, Alyssa, take it away.
Oh, sure. So what I'm working on now at Kind is a humanitarian parole program, a different one, but it is for families that were separated by the Trump administration at the US-Mexico border, which is the Ms. L litigation that Danielle was speaking of. It's the lawsuit that was brought because the Trump administration was separating families with a deterrence purpose. And the type of humanitarian parole that families receive under that program is 3 years long. And it is already, I speak to families about their legal questions about the program all day, every day. And that is the number one question that people have is what will we do when this program ends? And what way do we have to get permanent residence? And the answer is none, unless there's some other way that they're eligible for a family petition. They'd have to have a close family member who was already a citizen or a resident, or unless they could be eligible for asylum, that's possible. But if they're not eligible for something else, then there's just really nowhere that any of these humanitarian parole programs are going. So I agree with everyone else who already spoke about humanitarian parole programs. Just one really quick note about the other humanitarian parole programs as well is that they may end more quickly than not, because there's a lawsuit already where 19 states have filed suit against specifically the humanitarian parole programs for Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela, and not the Ukraine. So that's one. The Ukraine program so far has not been challenged as I understand it. So there's another moment of pause that the way that these programs are being implemented and challenged can be racially biased as well.
And just, following the change in policies and programs is like watching a high-speed tennis match, try to keep up with it. Yes. Autumn, do you want to have some closing thoughts?
Oh, sure. I would really advise, if at all possible, for you to have someone to help the attorney as a consultant in country conditions. Make sure that they're very, very, very competent and that they're doing it for the right reasons. I do it day in, day out. It is my life. I pretty much have 2 full-time jobs, essentially. So I constantly know what is going on. So you want to make sure that you have very competent consultant that can help back up that attorney to bring around a win for your case.
Megan, closing thoughts?
Sure. I think that there's a lot of different folks in this listening to this panel. And so although you might not work every day with migrant children, they are in our community. They're attending our schools. They're making friends with your kids. And I just ask that you try to advocate for them and for change in the ways that you can, whether it's locally, changes in your school, making language access more accessible, whether it's statewide with the Husky for Immigrants bill, or federally with the more systemic change that needs to happen. It's just, we are in desperate need of change. And so I just ask each and every one of you to sort of take that away from this panel.
Thank you, Megan. Alicia, a closing thought. We have 1 minute.
I mean, I think Megan said it. I think, coming and listening and learning and sharing this information is so critical, and doing what we can to support children, right? These children who are vulnerable, and ensuring that they can access competent legal counsel and have effective, efficient, safe ways to obtain the lawful forms of immigration relief for which they are eligible, so that they can live a life of dignity and safety here in the United States.
Thank you. I think that was very well said. Dignity is always such a strong word that resonates with me in thinking about immigration and wanting to, yes, push the protections forward so that more people can access that state here. So thank you to everyone for coming out for this panel. We wish you a good evening, and we'll hopefully engage you in future panels. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.